I want to open up a bit of discussion across the panel, and I think in view obviously of the fact, Martin, as you remarked at the outset, that you're somewhat singular here in terms of the issues, I certainly want to make sure that we give you time. But could I perhaps, John, it's not to stereotype, but since you are from The Economist and a media background, could I ask you, and I'm sure the other panelists can tell us about this also, what is the current state of British public opinion on the question which we now discuss, according to the most recent opinion polls?
Well, I think I can answer that because it's been quite interesting, actually. I mean, British public opinion tends to be more sceptical about the European Union than any other country. Although, actually, there are some countries of Central and Eastern Europe that produce even lower scores when they are asked, do you think the European Union is a good thing, and do you think our membership of the European Union is a good thing? But both the polling from Eurostat and the polling most recently from the Pew Global Studies suggests that actually the British have moved much more strongly in favour of staying in the European Union in the last 5 years than before. It's slightly guesswork why that should be, but I would offer two reasons. I think the first is because the issue of whether we should stay in the European Union has become more definitive now. And I think when people think about it, partly for the reason that David Hannay gave, that Europe is not a top priority for most people, when they actually focus on this issue, they begin to think maybe the alternatives are not as attractive as we thought, and therefore maybe we think the European project is better. It's better to stay in. The second thing, which I think nobody has touched on, and I tend myself, as a typical Brit with a transactional view of Europe, not to put much emphasis on it, but I think there is something in it. The second is Vladimir Putin. I think because of what Putin has done in the last 3 years, the idea that the European project is actually quite important for our security as well as for our economic well-being has acquired some resonance across Europe, including in the UK.
Thank you very much. And again, one other, if I might ask, a media-related question. It's a question of perspective or opinion, but I have a feeling that the British print media and some of the broadcast media back in the 70s, when there was a referendum, were net more positive than negative. And one has a feeling that for a lot of the popular media that has changed. And I might cite, in reference to that, a phrase that several years ago appeared in a speech by Tony Blair, where he talked about, as regards Europe, the feral qualities of the British media, about Europe and some other things. So just again, from your media background, what is your sense of that dynamic? In other words, you all, if you were campaigning, will fire your ammunition, but it will be transmitted through other media to wider public opinion. How will they mediate how you will campaign on these kinds of issues for those who would campaign?
Well, first of all, sadly, I don't think we at The Economist will be very influential in this debate, which is to be regretted. I think two thoughts that I have on that. I think it is clearly true that in 1975, the overwhelming support for the media was to stay in. And I think this time that will be less true than it was then. Nobody actually quite knows which way the main British newspapers will jump, but it looks as if the Express Group, the Mail Group, possibly the Daily Telegraph, in fact I would say probably the Daily Telegraph, and possibly some of the Murdoch papers will all campaign for out. And that means that is definitely different from 1975, and it's one of the reasons why I think it would be unwise to assume there will be a very large majority, 2-1, as there was in 75, because I think the weight of the campaign will be somewhat different. The only way I would qualify that, however, is that I think the media generally, the print media anyway, of which I'm a part, are somewhat less influential than they used to be everywhere. The broadcast media may play a bigger role, but I think they will be more neutral. But the explosion of the internet and social media and so on means that in a way, the print media, I think, are probably somewhat less significant than they used to be.
Thank you. Martin, if I could turn to you, and I do invite you, as I said, to pick up, as you wish, some of the points that you've listened to. But if I might ask you a question, then going back to the referendum in the 70s, which one shouldn't exaggerate, but it offers some political insight, and taking into account some of the comments made on this panel, if there is a significant part of the Conservative Party which will promote an out vote and which will vote for out and lead part of that campaign, is there any conceivable result, including if there's a yes result, that would cause that group to cease fire? In other words, do we end up with a British settlement definitively, or do we end up, in effect, with the debate and the divisions continuing, almost irrespective of the outcome?
Well, I don't know. That's looking... sorry, is this working? Yeah. That's really looking a long way ahead. I think one of the problems with the 1976 referendum campaign is that it was very easily characterised, whether rightly or wrongly, as turning out to be a deceptive campaign. In that what happened is that Harold Wilson's government put forward what it claimed to be renegotiation of the terms of membership, and the matters that were renegotiated, quite frankly, were so insignificant, I can't even remember what they were, but that they weren't significant at all. They were presented as significant. In addition, whatever may have been, was in the treaties and written in the treaties, the campaign presented it very much as a bread and butter issue, economic benefit, the common market. It was sold to the British people on that basis. And of course, the problem is, having secured a referendum result on that basis, it wasn't treated as legitimate by those who opposed it. Now, that said, it did win, the yes vote did win by a very wide margin on that occasion. Now, what happens this time depends, yes or no, or whatever. Actually, I think one point, if I could add to what John Peet said about the polls and so forth, I think what we've witnessed over the last few years in Britain is we've seen the rise of the United Kingdom Independence Party, which has moved up from having, I think it was 4 million votes in the last general election. About 14% of the electorate voted for it, although because the vote was widely distributed, they only elected one member of parliament. Now, I don't know whether around here or in Switzerland, does anyone eat Marmite or even know what it is?
2 volunteers.
So very few, very few. Well, Marmite is an extremely strong-tasting substance. I think it's made from yeast, and it's put on toast by certain eccentric people in Britain and eaten. And the thing about Marmite is either you love it or you hate it. And there are lots of people, some people who love it, and there are many people who hate it. And I think the problem with the United Kingdom Independence Party and Nigel Farage, its leader, is that it's very much a Marmite proposition. Sorry, I didn't catch. Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, and he and his party do secure quite strong support from a certain section of the public, but on the other hand, they put off others who are less committed to their basic point of view. So I think what will be important, and I must say, I've never been attracted by the idea of being in any way involved with or associated with the United Kingdom Independence Party. Personally, I've always been a Conservative supporter and a member of the Conservative Party. And I think what will be important is that the campaign for a no vote, if the Prime Minister doesn't succeed in producing a renegotiation that satisfies a large block of the Conservative Party, is that the campaign is very broadly based. Is based not on, if you like, divisive issues or narrow issues like preventing immigration from Eastern Europe, but is based on much broader issues and positive issues, issues that certainly I believe in, like the positive ability of our country to, to trade in the world more favourably if it renegotiates its relationship with the European Union. And finally, on that point, there's one point in Lord Hannay's address with which I strongly agree, and that is, he said, well, what needs to be made clear is what is the alternative to European Union membership. That is a very important issue because a no vote to European Union membership then leads on to the question of what kind of relationship would the United Kingdom have following that vote. I have this sort of nightmarish fear that the civil servants in Whitehall will not do any planning for this eventuality whatever. They will wake up the day after a no vote and will then run around like headless chickens, dreaming up some association agreement with the European Union which has all the disadvantages of membership and none of the benefits. So it's actually very important that a positive alternative is developed. The other speakers are quite right, I think, in decrying European Economic Area membership as being any sort of acceptable substitute for membership of the European Union on the part of the United Kingdom. On the other hand, every part of continental Europe that isn't actually a member of the European Union is in a free trading relationship with the European Union of one kind or other, I think with the sole exception of Belarus. The other important factor in which perhaps we differ from other countries is that we are better customers of the European Union than they are of us in terms of value of goods and services bought and value of goods and services sold. So I find it inconceivable that a mutually beneficial trading relationship cannot be fashioned in the event of a no vote.
Let me ask you, David, can you take a note of whatever intervention you want to make, and I will come to you presently. Let me ask you, if I could, Martin, to a point that David Hannay made earlier about the United Kingdom, generally speaking, being a parliamentary and not a plebiscitary democracy, so more used to votes in Parliament than votes in referenda. Not to question the referendum, this will happen because the legislation will provide for it. But to ask you a slightly different question, given that the constitutional tradition has been one of parliamentary democracy more than plebiscitary in form, can you really argue that all the things that happened after joining in 1973 were some way delegitimised? Because it always required a UK government to negotiate a treaty, and it required a majority of whichever party or parties in power to legitimise through parliamentary democracy the ratification of treaties. So the sense that somehow you got a bum deal because things were slipped in, unknowns to the United Kingdom, seems to entirely dismiss the weight of the parliamentary democracy, which is one of the great British constitutional traditions.
Well, I mean, that is a very interesting issue. Indeed, up to the second half of the last century, you could say that the British Constitution really never recognised referendums at all, unlike many other constitutions which do, or have. Switzerland, of course, has some central function. However, the British Constitution is flexible, and I think has been changing over the years, because what has been happening is that where issues of major constitutional change have been involved, there has been a practice, not laid down in any law or written constitution, of holding referenda. So, for example, the devolution of powers to Scotland, Wales, and indeed of Northern Ireland was coupled with referenda. The difficulty, I think, and of course you're quite right, that, for example, major steps in European integration, such as the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty, were approved by the House of Commons, by a vote of the House of Commons, by Parliament. And the problem with it is that, and I think the difference is, normally Parliament can make and unmake any law under our Constitution. One Parliament can make a law, next Parliament is elected with a different political composition, it can unmake it. The problem with the European process is that the ratification of these treaties is something that cannot be unmade by the subsequent Parliament. It results in a transfer of the powers of Parliament, which then fetters the subsequent Parliament. So there is a sort of constitutional difference, which is perhaps why the pressure for a referendum has happened. Indeed, I mean, although it didn't happen, we got to a situation where the political parties were all promising referenda, or the major political parties were all promising referenda on membership of the euro currency, if that had gone forward to a stage where it had been recommended by the government. So under our flexible constitution, I think we are getting increasing recognition of referenda, although the circumstances in which they, must or must not, that there's no rigid rule about when they must be held or must not be held.
Thank you. I just make a short observation for my own part. I live in the Republic of Ireland. I've taken part in a lot of referenda campaign on Europe, and since 1973 we've had 10 referenda on Ireland in Europe. 2 of them we voted twice because we thought the treaties were so good, and we've had a lot of that activity. David Hannay, I think you wanted to come in on something, and then I might come to you with 1 or 2 supplementary questions.
Well, I'm slightly less confident than John Peet about the polls. Undoubtedly, the polls are showing at the moment a considerable majority for those who wish to stay in rather than those who wish to leave. But 2 things need to be remembered. One is that the pollsters at the moment have a huge amount of egg on their faces because they completely miscalculated the general election we've just had. And so people are a bit cautious. And then one of them, whom I respect greatly, Peter Kellner of YouGov, has always said, and I think he's right about this, that when you ask people what they regard as a theoretical or academic question, they give you an answer which isn't probably very carefully thought through, and that the real answer only emerges very close to the vote on that proposition, which is not now. So I would be a bit cautious about that. I also think that we are, on media terms, sailing into quite troubled waters. As John Peters said, the print media are less and less influential now, and much less so than in the 70s, when I would agree with him that they were grossly unbalanced in their handling of the 75 referendum. And when they were very influential. They're not so influential now. And I think what are called social media and all these other things are, as we saw at the time of the Scottish referendum, are hugely active and pretty scary, frankly. I mean, a lot of the tweeting and blogging that went on in the Scottish referendum was horrifying. I mean, people were being threatened with their lives, were being insulted and abused on these media. And in fact, the nationalist in Scotland supporters, who were the most intemperate on the whole, did quite a lot of damage to their cause. So I don't know how it will go. And the other thing I would say is that opinion in Britain seems to me now to be not as deferential as it was in the 1970s, not as likely to take a party lead as it was, so that a situation which could be the one we will have, in which the leaders of the 3 main parties, the leaders of the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat parties, plus the Scottish nationalists, are all campaigning to stay in, is not necessarily one which they will carry all their supporters along with them. So I think there are genuine risks there. As to the question of will the referendum in 2016 or 17 settle this once and for all, I'm afraid I am very, very cynical about that. In 1975, and it was nothing whatsoever to do with whether or not the campaign was a fair one or whether it dealt with just trade or dealt with wider issues. I lived all the way through that campaign. I worked for somebody who participated heavily in that campaign. He made speeches about nothing at all except the political issues. And so did Mrs. Thatcher, and so did a lot of other people. But the point I'm making is this. Within 6 months of the 75 referendum, which was a crushing defeat for those who wanted to leave, the Labour Party supporters of leaving were back on the warpath. And within 5 years, they had captured the Labour Party. And in the 1982 general election, the Labour Party manifesto contained a commitment to leave, and always known in the jargon as the longest suicide note in history. It did not, of course, succeed, and the Labour Party changed its mind. But so I'm sorry to be cynical about it, but I'm afraid that even after quite a clear-cut result, I don't believe that it will settle matters for eternity, although I do think that the British electorate's appetite for arguing about Europe will be rather heavily satiated by the experience they'll have just gone through. And so anyone who tries, as the Labour Party did in 1982, to bring them back to the subject and to change the outcome will probably for quite a long time have rather modest success. So that may discourage them.
Permit me, if I can, to pick up a point you made. You talked about two parallel processes, and indeed much of the media focus outside the UK has been on what does Mr. Cameron want, how will he fashion his question, and what is he likely to get. But you raised the other parallel question of the legislation on the referendum within the United Kingdom. You mentioned interesting things about campaign, not a lot about financing, but I know from Ireland this is always a hypersensitive issue about finance, balance, and the role of the state in those terms. You talked about who might vote, the age of voters, who's in, who's out of voting. To ask you a general question, where you locate yourself in that debate, because of course you're in the House of Lords, and the House of Lords will be a player. And is this one of the areas where the House of Lords and the House of Commons may at some moment face each other down as they argue for the different qualities and perspectives on the legislation?
Well, that could happen. In theory, there will not be any changes to the legislation in the Commons because the government has an overall majority. So, in theory, the bill should emerge from the Commons as it is now. It's not absolutely certain that that will happen, but it's more likely than not, I expect, because people will be reluctant to object to their own government that's just been elected, although there may be some mini rebellions. In the House of Lords, the government does not have a majority. The Conservative Party, which is the government, does not have a majority. The majority can be made up of Labour, Liberal Democrats and crossbenchers. There are a couple of UKIP members too, but they don't count significantly in numbers. And there are no Scots in the House of Lords because they have refused to take seats there, although there are quite a lot of them in the House of Commons. So it's hard to be sure. The House of Lords can't force the House of Commons to do something, but it can make it think again. And on an issue like, say, 16 to 17-year-olds getting the vote, I think there are quite a few people, even in the Conservative Party, who think that for this case, which is, after all, a once-and-for-all decision, that would be the right thing to do. So we will see. There could be changes proposed by the House of Lords, which will then be accepted by a majority in the House of Commons. But I don't want to overstate it. I mean, I think the areas which actually will be the most difficult for the government to handle in this are things that are missing from the legislation, which is the one that Martin spelled out and I spoke about, which is asking the government what it will do on the day after a no vote, because that is the only way that the electorate will know what is likely to happen. Now, that's nowhere in the legislation, but it could be. Similarly, there is nowhere in the legislation a requirement that they provide objective material about the costs and benefits of membership. Similarly, there are bodies that could provide that, and so these matters will be debated pretty vigorously, I think, and we'll see where we come out in the end. I don't want to predict. Asking me where I stand, I always like to be in the majority.
A safe diplomatic position after a long career. Martin Bailey, I think for the moment, the thing that distinguishes you on this panel, because of course this campaign will be engaged eventually, is that you are the president of a campaigning organisation that has in fact constituted itself to be engaged. So how would you, from the space when I don't speak as functionary of the European Commission, but your group is, I think, primarily, but not necessarily exclusively, Brussels-based. How would you get involved in a campaign like that, and what would you bring to it as a group of concerned UK, perhaps also other EU citizens, and how would you hope to have an impact?
Okay, I think you've just, thank you, Pat, for the question. You've just asked us about our business plan for the next year. It's a very complicated thing operating from Brussels, of course, when it's a UK-based campaign, and probably coming from Brussels, we're probably not that welcome in the UK. I think some of the things that we can offer is that we are experts in EU matters. So certainly on the factual and the statistical, we can get, and the legal and the economic, we can give the correct answers. We can do a lot of the myth busting. We're there essentially to establish links with the UK. I don't think we ourselves, as Pro-Europa, are going to be leading any campaign, but we will help provide material, we can help brief people, and we can be used as a resource. One thing very important, though, that we've slightly touched upon but not gone into is the attraction of politics to younger people. Now, over half of our members are under 30 now, because we made a concerted effort to ensure that the younger people in Brussels working in institutions and private companies around get back engaged in politics. Because a lot of people, the younger generation in Europe, all over Europe, not just the UK, feel disenfranchised, disconnected from what they regard as the establishment. Now, we think it's very important that the 16 and the 17-year-old do get fully involved in the campaign, they do get behind it, as well as the people who are also based abroad, because the 2 million or so who live outside of the UK, if they all have to come back le lendemain, then it's very much their future which will be in the balance. And all the more so for the 16 and 17-year-olds, because with respect to people on the panel, it'll be much more their future that you'll be deciding and debating about than ourselves. So it's going to be a complicated issue, and we are certainly in touch with the key lead organisations in the UK. I just wanted to say one thing about what would happen the next day. I don't know what the mood would be, and this is hearsay, in France or Germany and the other larger member states, if the UK had gone through this protracted, very, very complicated, delicate process. Would they be especially ready to hand out large-scale concessions to make the divorce, no allusion to Strauss-Kahn, an amiable settlement? Some doubts hover over that. And I just wanted to say something about red tape in the kind of, I must defend my bureaucratic capacity, the reels of red tape I have in my office ready to strangle any business or entrepreneur. You may find that it's actually the bigger businesses who like red tape to be used against the startups and the entrepreneurs. But there's good red tape and there's bad red tape, and the Timmermans, the Vice President's reforms include better regulation, which is a lot of checks and balances. And I may argue, perhaps I dare to argue that European legislation probably goes through a lot more checks and balances than it does at UK level. It's an enormous process of impact assessments going through the two houses, back and forth, and the co-decision procedure. But on the red tape itself, it's like cholesterol. There's good cholesterol and there's bad cholesterol. And a lot of countries regard some of the liberalization that has taken place in large areas of European law is directly due to British influence. And this has benefited English companies hugely. And they believe that this is the product of some Anglo-American liberal shindig. If you take, for example, the telecommunications legislation, which was a huge liberalization, it was the dismantling of state-owned monopolies. This was pushed by the British, and that gave birth to companies such as Vodafone, that you'll be aware is one of the largest players in the telecommunications market globally now, and that was a result of intervention into markets that was closely protected, that were closed shut like crocodile jaws of national protectionism. So not all red tape and regulation is bad. It allows companies, particularly British companies, to go out there and to invest and to explore and create new markets, whereas national protectionism can close them down or prevent them. And if you think what I'm saying is utter nonsense, then look at what's happening now with the Uber case all over Europe.
Okay, I might add, but it's just a footnote. If I look at one Irish company which 30 years ago was established and which carried 50,000 passengers, Ryanair, it became rather a big beneficiary of air transport liberalisation, and this year on its 30th birthday expects to carry 100 million passengers. And it tells something about the dualism of those kinds of things. I'm going to ask one more question, if I could, of Martin Howe, and then turn to the audience. Martin, you made the point that we need, so kind of collectively, to think of this question of what else, the no scenario and the morning after. You're not elected in the Conservative Party, but it's clear in terms of papers you've contributed and the way they've been picked up politically that you're somewhere in the space that I might call a thought leader. So what is your leading thought about what the answer to the morning after question would be?
Well,
in the event of a no vote.
Okay, I mean, one point, a very important point, is it's not just a question for the United Kingdom. It is a question for the United Kingdom and the other member states. And therefore, it has to be a solution which is not only in the interests and benefit for the United Kingdom, but one which equally is in the interests of and for the benefit of the member states who we would hope to negotiate it with. Which is in a sense why I started this afternoon by saying, what is a positive, throwing out to our audience here, what is the positive way forward, which allows continued European integration without, as it were, a possible continued drag from the United Kingdom's slightly awkward squad behaviour over the years. But fundamentally, I think, as I mentioned before, the European Economic Area doesn't provide any sort of credible model for the United Kingdom were it to depart from European Union membership, because it involves an effective obligation to comply with not only the existing body of regulations, but effectively with future regulations in which we wouldn't have a vote, and with future jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, in which we'd no longer be involved as an institution. And I think the Swiss people were extremely sensible in their referendum result in rejecting European Economic Area membership back in December 1992. 82 wasn't it? 92, sorry, get my decades confused. So, but the fundamental point is that the United Kingdom is a bigger customer of the European Union than it is an exporter to it, and therefore a mutually beneficial relationship. The European Union, I believe, is not going to throw away its best customer. So I don't think we need to be concerned about what is sometimes said, oh, well, they won't allow you to trade with them unless you agree to all these extra things that they'll ask for. A trading relationship is inherently beneficial on both sides.
And so do you think, just a short answer, do you think then you will be developing Plan B and bringing it forward as part of the debate somewhere along the lines you just now described?
Well, I mean, I don't know more widely. I mean, personally, I have published, if you like, a paper on the mechanics of how the exit process will take place, involving both the changes to internal UK law and how those would be carried out, and the type of framework negotiation one should look for. And it's published by a body called Politea. You know, that's just my view, and it's not a matter in which, you know, many people have views on it. It's certainly a matter that requires discussion and development, which is why I think Lord Hannay's proposal to force the government to set up a planning unit and actually produce a coherent plan might be a very good idea for everyone concerned, whether they're pro or anti the vote.
Very good. So we might establish some consensus on the panel before we go, at least on methodology.